to jail for this thing. And so the point being is that there's a lot of roles that you have in all kinds of protests, but especially in civil disobedience. A lot of times you do a lot of planning, and you have people with very specific roles. So one of the roles that's very common is the dealing with the press one way or another, and there's different ways to tackle that. You can kind of do it as a collective, come up with whatever you want. But I do have some suggestions that have been sort of tried and true to some extent with groups that are dealing with the press. And they all sort of revolve around the fundamental understanding of what the press really is and what they really do and what they're really trying to do and what they're there trying to achieve, you know, and what kind of resources and power that they really have. And to expand on that, I mean, the press is a very well-funded, very powerful entity in our society, and not something you want to deal with naively or just walk into without any idea of what, you know, their objective is or what kind of motives or connections that they have. And so, really, when it comes down to it, they're motivated by profit. You know, they're funded by their advertising dollars, and their friends are all in these industries that you're protesting more likely. And it's very likely that whatever you're protesting, whether it's a university or a government agency or a corporation or a nation altogether, I mean, that they're going to have a much more of a leverage on the local newspaper and local TV stations than, say, some scruffy, you know, animal rights activists are going to have. So you're walking into a situation where you have to understand that the odds are against you as far as getting your message across. You might be able to do some things that more or less guarantee that you're going to get some attention, but then from there, what kind of attention is that, and what are you going to do with it? You know, aka how are you going to handle the press? What message are you going to get across? I've had a lot of experience handling the press. Most of it actually isn't for civil disobedience, it's for direct action. More spectacular and illegal stuff, but I got into that through dealing with the press for civil disobedience actions and for protest actions. And other organizing, like organizing for conferences that happen to draw media attention. And so, the standard thing, the first thing I learned while being trained by older activists, more experienced activists at the time, was to understand this concept of sound bites. They'll ask you questions about whatever they want, and the more extreme or sensational the action that you're representing to the press is, the more interested they'll be, but also the more interested they'll be in the extreme and sensational aspect, and not necessarily what you're there to talk about, right? So if you do a real extreme or sensational action, you know, to protect a forest, they're not going to necessarily be interested in talking about that forest and why it needs to be protected. They're going to be interested in talking about why you did this extreme sensational thing, and is that justifiable, and how is that not violent, and, you know, why are you not a terrorist, and all this, you know, depending on how extreme it is and sensational it is, the more they'll be pushing the direction away from the issue that you're there trying to talk about, and towards the issue that they talk about 24/7 on these news stations, which is, world is crazy. Look at me. Look at the TV. Watch me over and over again. This is like crazy stuff. Cars crashing, police shooting, all this stuff. That's what they love, right? And so you've got to be able to be prepared for that, and to be able to redirect the conversation back towards the point that you're making. Now, this isn't a conversation. You need to understand, first of all, when you're dealing with the press, this is not a conversation like you're having with your family or with friends or with someone on the street. You're trying to talk about issues. You're trying to both grow. It's not a two-way street. You're not trying to learn from them while trying to teach something to them. That's not what's happening. They're not learning anything from you. They're doing a job, and their job is to project the agenda of their funders at your expense. Like, the more you understand that, and maybe even more extreme definition than that, then the better off you are walking into the situation, because they're pigs. Okay? Oh, animal rights companies. They're not pigs, they're bad people. Right? They're evil. They've got an agenda that is essentially exploitative of you and your cause and everything that isn't about making money and profiting. Right? So, you need to understand while walking into them. So the first thing I was taught to step back is about sound bites. So they can ask you whatever they want, most likely their questions, unless you're in like a sit-down debate type of scene inside a TV production studio, most likely you're not even going to hear their questions on the final edited piece. You know, they don't have the news anchor or the camera person being, oh, well, what do you think of this? You know, if they do, they have someone standing there, whatever. Most of the time, you don't hear their questions, they just edit your answers and put those up on air. So you don't have to answer their questions. Forget their questions. They ask you about like, oh, well, isn't this illegal? How can you justify this? Don't talk about it. Don't answer that. Go back to your point about the forest you're trying to protect, or the animals you're trying to save, or whatever issue that you're working on, and say that. And then they'll try to reach you back again to the issue that they're excited about. Well, you know, you could have killed somebody with that U-lock. Forget about that question again. Go back again. State your point again. And don't say more than what you have to say. Practice your sound bites or your message or whatever it is over and over again before you deal with them, because they're looking not just to talk about how horrible and violent you are and how terrible this situation is, but they're looking to make you look like an idiot, to de-justify what you are and what you stand for in any way they can. So the more you blabber on and say and scratch your head and and take a long time to answer questions or go off topic, the more likely it is that they're going to put those parts on the news and take out the good parts. So, like for example, one time I did an interview with a program that was on National Geographic TV. It was like a sit-down interview in a studio, and it was a bigger deal. And we went through this whole, it's like a 45-minute long program, so we went through like an hour-long interview, and afterwards, me and the people I went there with were like, oh, you really nailed that. You know, I felt really good about it. I was like, yeah, you know, you answered all the questions, you like redirected, I can't wait for this program to come out. It's going to be great. And then the cast came back to me and they were like, oh yeah, you did such a good job. We had such a good time with this one. This is our favorite program of the year. Do you want to sit down and film another episode with us right now? Because we might make this into a 2-part series, and then part 1 and part 2. And I thought, oh, that's a great opportunity, and I'm flying high and I'm feeling really good. I'm also really tired, right? I've also addressed all the points that I came there to address, but I'm not thinking about that. So I make the mistake of sitting down and doing this other interview. Of course, they had no intention of doing a 2-part series, right? What they had an intention of is doing a program that was, you know, not going to make me look as favorable as what I was going to look with that first amount of material they had. So what they did is had a second interview where I was more tired, I was more exhausted, I was a little more annoyed. I just didn't, it wasn't awful, but it wasn't as great as the first one was. And so, you know, by lying and manipulating to me, which is part of their job, they were able to create one episode that was less of a home run, so to speak, than the first one would have been if I had done that. So you need to kind of get, you know, and at that point I was very experienced. So it's not like you could ever be you know, a pro at this, but the concept of, you know, being aware of what they really stand for, again, not leading sheep to slaughter. I mean, you've got to know what you're dealing with and what the real consequences are. So, understand the media and the press and what their role is in a repressive society, and that is to perpetrate the status quo, and to keep, you know, keep your message of change and freedom and justice out. Really, if you get it in at all, it's going to be coupled with this concept of something negative, and it's, you know, it's going to be very limited what you can get through the press. So be prepared for that, and learn to try to manipulate them as much as they manipulate you if you can. One last quickie. While doing press work for the Earth Liberation Front, which is where most of my experience is, they're a much more radical element than anything we can talk about with civil disobedience. You know, they always wanted to bring it back to, oh, you're burning down these corporate headquarters. How can you say that's nonviolent? How can you say that's, you know, that's going to bring about positive social change? It's just violence, it's just terrorism, it's just awful. And that debate for a long time was really what most of the news coverage that we got wanted to focus on. They didn't want to focus on, oh, that corporate headquarters was also like, you know, tearing down all the last of the old growth forest in the Pacific Northwest, and so we were trying to stop that, and they weren't listening to decades of civil disobedience, decades of protest, and all these nonprofit dollars going into it, so we said, we're going to step up the pressure. They didn't want to talk about that. They wanted to talk about, okay, this is violent, you're just like, well, Al-Qaeda or whatever. And so for a while, we tried to deal with property destruction as in violence, blah, 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 but later on I took a different angle, which is just something to think about. and that is that they would say, okay, you're violent, you're a terrorist, whatever, whatever, you know, debunk that.